Welcome to the Hay Kings podcast, brought to you by Crone, dedicated to hay and forage producers. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by one of our usual suspects, Mr. Jeffrey Alfalfa Jackson, and we're also joined by Leta Larson. Now, they're counterparts, both alfalfa and forage specialists with Croplan. Today, we're going to talk about alfalfa yields, and I made an observation on social media and got a little argumentative about the nature of alfalfa yields, because if you look at the national alfalfa yield on national, big picture, throwing everybody in the country together, our alfalfa yield, here's a fun one. If we just look at individual years, and that's not fair because of the weather variation, the national alfalfa yield in 2019 was lower than the national alfalfa yield in 1919. That's a lie. That was for the state of Nebraska. So there are individual observations where in over 100 years, we didn't make progress.
Interesting to hear.
Nationally, we've tapped out at about 3.5 ton to the acre. And then on the grass side, the trend isn't much better. We're tapped out. We're flatlining at about 2 ton to the acre. That's a really hard number to characterize because it is a national number. That's irrigated production in the West. That's swamp production. I mean, that's everywhere, right? That's everything.
Yes.
It's an unfair number, but the trend line on corn is ever increasing. 1.9% per year is the number that I came to, and I don't know if that's exactly right, but it's pretty close.
Well, you take 200 bushel corn, that's 3.8 bushels a year. I don't think that's out of line per se.
And one of the concerns that I have in all of this is if the yield differential, we're looking at those trend line yields, we have an expectation that corn yields are going to get better and better and better, and we just don't have that in alfalfa. And I worry about the structure of the industry, where corn acres will continue to displace alfalfa acres. That disincentivizes variety production, that disincentivizes competition in the marketplace. I mean, it's not a good industry structure to see your crop losing badly.
Acres and yield at the same time.
Acres and yield. Well, and that's the other observation. We peaked out in alfalfa, total alfalfa production just shy of 30 million acres. Today we're at 15 million acres. Mm-hmm. So this is having a meaningful impact from the economist's standpoint. I'm watching harvest infrastructure, because that means if we're replacing alfalfa with corn and dairy rations, that means we're selling choppers and not balers, and the investment is going into choppers. That means we're selling corn seed, not alfalfa seed. That means the investment's going into alfalfa. This is why I'm fired up about this conversation, and I want to hear what you guys have to think about it.
John, and I think the interesting thing about how this conversation will go is we have extremes. You live in a severe desert. Leta lives in a part of the world that is 40 plus inches of natural rainfall. Mm-hmm. And when we consider just geographical differences in what's going on with yield, and I think, and I don't know if we want to start with water.
Oh, we got to start with water.
That's one of the factors, absolutely.
And I would agree wholeheartedly that the loss in irrigated alfalfa production in the West, think water issues in California, Arizona, probably extending into Texas, that Ogallala Aquifer. That means that a smaller portion of the national alfalfa crop is being grown on highly productive irrigated acres. And I don't want to throw rocks at Montana, but the reality is Montana and the Imperial Valley are not the same. So a larger portion of the crop is being grown in places like Michigan and Montana and New York.
So we take those water infrastructure needs, the water availability needs, and I'm even going to go one step further and even talk maybe water quality. So as we as we change maybe even some of those things, I mean, how many different pivots do we see in different areas that we talk about salinity issues where we're pumping saltier water over time, or we create more soil conditions and limitations to alfalfa growth and development just based on the quality of water we get to use, the availability of water. So maybe we're trying to get by with a little bit less. Did you not just have a podcast representing a gentleman from Arizona that said we deficit irrigate with 1.2 inches per cutting?
That means they're doing 12 cuttings, 10, 11, 12 cuttings with just a little over an inch per cutting. Yeah.
And barely yielding more than what Leta does in Michigan on 4 cuts or 5 cuts. Because anyway, so there's so much different, the dynamics from water across our country alone, let alone internationally and globally, how that impacts things. But
I have a fun one on water quality so long as we're still there. I was talking to a producer from Oregon yesterday, and he was telling stories in some of those volcanic regions. The water quality is the wells can have hyper concentrations of nutrients. So sometimes they'll hit a pocket of sulfur. Sometimes they'll hit a pocket of boron. And that was the example that he gave me, is that the water had so much boron that after a couple of years, they couldn't grow anything out there anymore.
They had a toxicity.
Yeah.
I wasn't just having a bad dream. That stuff really happens for real, that our water quality impacts yield.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I looked at the graph that you had represented your first conversation with. That's a little controversial, as you mentioned earlier. But in the big dips for me, as I looked at that, where it pulls down averages too, when you consider the drought we had in 11 and 12, and then again back around 21, 22, parts of 23 in different sections of our country, I'm like, that certainly did not help the graph at all.
I do want to be careful about that, because Trendline expressly ignores individual drought years. Yeah.
And we all know how that works. But I would say, yes, that it's been hard for us to see some of those gains over time.
I got into a little bit of a spitting match on Facebook over this very topic. And the producer that I was interacting with says, my alfalfa yields are still going up.
Right.
And I believe him. And this is where I'm going to publicly say, I'm sorry. Sometimes intent and sincerity and kindness are hard to communicate in Facebook comments.
But I think also, John, the fact that you challenged something, and usually, and I've done this enough with you, we've had a lot of these conversations where we grin and wink back and forth and go, yeah, I know, but I'm going to ask the question that nobody wants to ask. And let's have a discussion about it so we can kind of talk about both sides of it, the cons, the pros, where we're going with it, how we can get past some of these issues. So from a moderator standpoint, if you want to say it this way, what you do is the right thing because you poke the bear just a little bit so you can have this discussion about what's going on and why. I mean, that's your job, whether people want to realize it or not. You're there to poke the bear.
Oh, yeah. You have to sometimes. Otherwise, you don't make any progress. You can't just accept the norms. We're not accepting any norms. Let's bring Leta into this, and I want to ask.
Absolutely, please.
And I want to ask, on individual farms, do you see yield improvement?
I would say that would depend on the farm.
It depends.
That goes into that ruffling feathers conversation.
Yep.
But management is a huge piece, right? So I guess to back up a little bit and set the stage for my region, who I'm dealing with, what the grower is. So I work east of the Mississippi, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Indiana. Lots of very, very large dairy operations. So Michigan, New York, those would be my two biggest states. Huge dairy states, right? So we're seeing, in Michigan, probably average dairy size, 1,500 cows or more. A lot of growers, going to 5,000 cows, 6,000 cows. That's just the new norm, right? So I would say majority of my region is chopping alfalfa for haylage. So not a lot of dry hay done in New York or Michigan at all. We are seeing lots of very large equipment running across alfalfa fields, choppers designed to harvest 30-ton corn silage, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, again, that water, in that I'm kind of in a bit of a swamp, right? Like normal waterfall, especially where I am, I'm 10 miles from Lake Michigan, we're probably getting 40 inches of water a year. So I'm working with growers that are constantly looking for the correct weather window, probably running over alfalfa when it's too wet to do so. So you get into that wheel traffic issue, you get into disease, different things like that. So I guess when you ask the question, what am I seeing on farms? It would depend on the farmer. It would depend on their management practices, depend on specific varieties with disease resistance that they're planting, fertility, pH, all of that good stuff. So there's a lot of different things management wise and variety wise that play a role in what I'm seeing on farms as far as yield goes.
They're not using double 9 sickle mowers and round balers with dump rakes. I mean, so
exactly,
the wheel traffic difference in those scenarios is quite a little bit different.
Yeah. And this wheel traffic thing, it really is huge. So Jeff reached out to me about doing this podcast. And my first initial thought on why is alfalfa yield not increasing the same rate of corn? Wheel traffic. That was the first thing that came into my head, because I see it on my own farm. I see it with the growers that I work with. A lot of these farmers are picking up ground that's 30 miles away from the farm, right? A lot of them are using semis. They're using straight trucks to get haylage back to the farm. What is that doing to the alfalfa stand? It's not good, right? So they know it. They'll admit it. You can see the actual tire tracks in the field where that alfalfa is either stunted or not growing. That crown is
in the next
damaged.
cutting. You can see it every time.
Exactly. And I think the growers, they know that, but they maybe don't fully realize the damage that is done to the crown and that root reserve. And anytime you hurt that crown, that's never going to come back from that, right? So the more you hurt that, the more injury we see there and the more yield loss you have.
As you're describing this damage, you're talking about you cut the plant, put it in a windrow, bring your chopper in, maybe the next day, a 24-hour wilt, 48-hour wilt. I don't know what you guys are running.
Or even the day of, like 6 hours of dry time, then you're in chopping immediately.
Okay, so in that case, those plants haven't had a time to expend energy growing new shoots quite yet.
Correct.
In our dry hay production, we come in a week later with rakes, and the alfalfa plant already has new shoots coming, and you break those shoots off and you start all over again. So that plant has expended energy growing that stem. Then you break it off with the rakes, and then you break it off with the baler, and then you break it off with the stacker, and you start all over again. And it's used energy to grow that. You break it off, and then it has to use more energy to start growing again. That's what I think about as damage. I hadn't just thought about crown damage. Can you take me through the physiology of that? Like, what does that crown damage look like, where it's not expending the energy, it's just getting damaged?
So in my mind, I'm going to throw mine out there first, Leta, and you go ahead but you get all that heavy. I mean, some of these trucks, right? When they pull in the field, they're already weigh 35,000 pounds. And then how many of them go out of that field? I hope the DOT's not listening, but how many of those go out of the field at a legal weight? I mean, we could be 100, whatever, right? 110, 120,000 pounds on a 53-foot trailer. So
Michigan has some really high limits.
Oh, yeah.
Like you guys can go to 150,000, can't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So literally you take all that pressure. I think first of all, you get compaction. You might actually, literally make a pancake out of that crown, because it's got moisture in it. It's succulent. It can split, crack. Again, we introduce more disease. And again, to your point, John, we're not running over stems that have already elongated. We're running over the crown where we're basically killing apical buds, I would call it, down at that crown surface and limiting those nice little pink shoots from taking off. So, just the sheer weight of those trucks and all that wheel traffic to get some of that done is, in my mind, And then other than just breaking them and compaction, I don't know.
The other thing that I face a lot is the cutting interval. And that gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And we've got dairy nutritionists, good, bad, indifferent, in the countryside pushing for, 50 or higher NDFD, 200 RFQ or higher, right? So I have some growers, especially those that are planting conventional alfalfa versus hard extra, and we'll get into that in a bit. But, I've got some growers planting a conventional product that are probably taking their cutting intervals 22, 23, 24 days after the previous cutting. So between the tighter cutting interval, maybe driving on wet fields with all the rainfall that we get, and knowing that they have to cut every 22 days. So that's what they're doing. They're not worried about the damage that they're doing in the field. They're worried about the quality piece that are out there. So between those two factors, plus the semis with the road tires and straight trucks with road tires, all that good stuff, that's what I see cause the biggest, I guess, yield decrease or, limiting factor to increasing that yield potential on the farms that I work with. And they know it. I would say the majority of the growers I work with know it, but especially the dairy farmers, and I don't want to group everybody into one group, but the majority of the growers that I'm working with are shooting for quality on haylage and strictly harvesting based on those quality numbers and not as focused on yield.
So now your recovery time is shorter.
It's shorter.
You don't get the carbohydrates stored. Yeah. It's kind of like making an athlete run a marathon every day versus having a few days off to recover.
Exactly.
I think we can all kind of correlate with that. If you just push and push and push, sometimes something's going to fall apart. And I think that's part of it too. And your friend in Arizona made that same comment. They're pushing less irrigation water, short cutting intervals, and taking a half to 3/4 of a ton per cutting. Where in some of these environments where we have guys maybe planted a Harvexter for a wider window, few less cuttings. I mean, I was just looking at some data from things that we pull off, and we have varieties that are taking 2.1 tons per cutting on average. That's a pretty good day. So it all comes back into perspective of how it's done, when it's done.
Looking to make a lighter footprint across your fields? Run Krone rakes. Available in working widths from 12.3 to 15.1 for single rakes and 18.8 all the way up to 62.4 feet in the twin and four rotor versions. Choose from multiple sizes and configurations to sweep across your field, gently lifting the crop into clean and boxy windrows. Ideal for the hungriest baler or chopper. Learn more at www.krone-northamerica.com.
I want to jump over I want to get to the university type trials. I want to get to the replicated trials under perfect conditions. And I want to know what's theoretically possible.
Well, so for example, and I didn't get very far because it was a late thought at the last minute. I looked up one yield data number and I couldn't find the second one. But I'm going to use, for example, in Wisconsin, pretty good environment, controlled environment, no wheel traffic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
4 cuts, 8.14 tons on 4 cuts. I know we have data from probably Washington State, or excuse me, Napa, Idaho, because we no longer have Tushy, Washington. But I think there's 12-ton alfalfa out there. John, I tell you, since I'm one of those guys that when people come up with a concept, I have to do it myself. I'm one of those guys that I'm going to run it through the ringer myself, touch it, feel it, play with it, and then go to the grower. I put a replicated trial on my own farm in South Dakota, 2012. 124 replications, mostly fall dormancy 4 material, and I raised nearly 10 ton of alfalfa per acre in Brookings, South Dakota in 2012. The state average is probably, like you said earlier with some of those numbers, less than 3.5 ton to the acre. I know for a fact that I have a gentleman on farm, dairy alfalfa production in that very similar area, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I-29. I'm pretty sure he sent me numbers this year that said 8 or 9, maybe 8 and 9 ton on different fields of dry matter produced. Dry land.
Okay, you guys don't have the Washington State data anymore, but Washington State University does run variety
Correct.
trials. And I had an early look at the data, but it was officially presented yesterday, so I can share it. The top performing variety on a 3-year total. Now I got to look at, I got to make sure I'm not talking. Okay, there's 2 different locations that they tested. They did 27.8 tons over 3 years on the top variety in one location. And in a little bit warmer, more conducive environment, 34.9 tons over 3 years.
Yep.
So that's north of 11 tons repeatedly.
Dry matter per acre.
Yeah, dry matter per acre.
Just clarify that, folks.
Yeah.
That's dry matter.
That's dry matter, not wet silage.
Yeah. So that's the interesting thing about it, my friend, is that the yield potential in these plants, it's like talking about corn or some of these other crops. Corn has the potential to make, I don't even remember the number now, but it's well more than what we get on an average today. It's what the environment does to limit, or how our management limits that yield potential. And that's the thing about alfalfa. When guys say, man, my alfalfa yields are going backwards, or they're just not good. The older varieties used to produce better than the new ones. What's going on?
Oh, wait, we're going to stop right there, because they use vernal as a check variety. So
Right.
we have, under the exact same growing conditions, new and improved varieties from a bunch of different companies, and we have vernal. And in every single test that they've run, vernal has come in dead last. Stop growing vernal. Stop it.
John?
Stop it. So, like I said, now we're going to talk about the 3-year yield, and this is in Pasco, Washington. This is where they hit just shy of 35 tons in 3 years. I don't know whether that's a 4 or 5 cutting system. My guess is it's 5. In that same spot, under the exact same management, exact same fertilizer program, everything exactly the same.
Correct.
Vernal did 27.8 tons.
Mm-hmm.
27
So
to
30%.
35. That's a huge freaking difference. And everybody that says, I can get seed cheaper somewhere else, goes and buys vernal, and you just lost 7 ton to the acre. And by my math, we're just going to use $200 a ton for dry hay. That's $1,400 an acre difference over 3 years. I promise you, you can afford seed that's more expensive than vernal.
Correct.
So it's interesting that you said that, because about 5 years ago, so I'm going to date that just a little bit to qualify it, but I did a lit review from all the public universities that had yield trials over multiple years. Mm-hmm. And I found something that was, I haven't done the statistics on it, but what I found is, yes, the top 10% of the new commercial varieties on average per year yielded 1.5 tons more than vernal every year. And that was, again, like Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, whichever ones at that point had a public system that I could go, because they all use vernal as a check. And that's great. I appreciate that. But yeah, on average across like 5 years in 6 states, it was at least 1.5 tons. So to your point, anyway, how you can't afford to not purchase newer genetics. And Leta, I'd love to segue into just, and maybe we're not done with that yet, but when we talk about genetic selections, and John, one of your questions is, what have we done? What's the industry going to do to respond to this silly yield decrease? So I want Leta to talk a little bit about some work that she is very, very near and dear with, and talk about varieties again. So to take this variety discussion one step further, what are we doing? What's happened in our environment that's caused maybe some yield drag? And what are we doing about it? So there, Leta, here's your silver platter.
Thank you. So I have a lot of thoughts on this, and there's a lot of background that went into the work and a lot of things coming out. So I could get really windy on this, but I'm going to do the best I can to keep it as short as possible. So back in 2020, I would have graduated from Michigan State, got hired in officially on the Croplan team, and moved out to Minnesota to work with FGI, which is our alfalfa breeding company at Land O'Lakes, Croplan, and the University of Minnesota to focus on alfalfa diseases. And I was very, very lucky to work with Dr. Debbie Samick at the University of Minnesota. She is the only alfalfa plant pathologist left in the country. So she is specifically focused on alfalfa diseases. And what we aimed to identify was first, all of the microbial community that is in the soil in alfalfa fields. So basically all of the different types of pathogens that might be out there. And the two types that we focused on were the fungal pathogens as well as the oomycete pathogens. And when you think of oomycetes, farmers are like, what the heck does that stand for? Like nobody even has probably heard of what that class is. I know when I came into it, I was like, what in the world is this? But that would be like your Phytophthora, your Pythium, your Aphanomyces. So the types that we really see infect alfalfa stands. So what's particularly difficult and interesting about that oomycete group of pathogens is they last in the soil for a really long time. So there's data that shows they can last 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years, even without the presence of a host crop. And that inoculum load, as you rotate into alfalfa, say you've got alfalfa in the rotation for 4 years, you rotate out for 2 or 3 years, you rotate back in. That inoculum is going to continue to build, especially in wet soil conditions. So that oomycete class of pathogens is known as the water mold pathogens. So continue to build in wet soils. So really, really a big deal, especially east of the Mississippi, where we have a lot of rainfall, but also a big deal where we have a lot of irrigation. So we see a lot of these pathogens, continue to infect alfalfa underwater. So I started my master's there, working with Debbie Samick, wanted to identify what's going on in the soil and if we're missing anything as far as the pathogen complex goes. So we knew at that time Aphanomyces was a big issue, still is, huge issue in the soil. But what Debbie was really after was to see if we're missing anything else as far as Pythium goes and as far as Phytophthora goes. And as I work with farmers now in my current role, I would say many are not aware that Pythium is as big of an issue as it is in alfalfa. And so what Pythium does is it will cause a seed rot and a damping off in our seedlings, but it does also continue to infect mature plants. And I think a lot of that was unknown for farmers and unknown in the industry at that time. So what we found in my data when we, complexed the soil and we took all of the basically genetic makeup of what's in the soil when alfalfa is growing, we saw that Aphanomyces was the biggest pathogen in those soils. And this was just done in Wisconsin soil. So keep that in mind as well. But we saw Aphanomyces was about 60% of the pathogen load in that soil, but Pythium was right behind it at like 30%. And what we also found was that our current control methods for Pythium, which is, a fungicide seed treatment. It's probably metalaxyl or mefenoxam, so Apron or Apron XL. That was breaking down in its efficacy. So we saw a lot of Pythium isolates that were or are becoming resistant to that fungicide. And you think about it, we've been using Apron since the 1970s. Obviously, over time, those Pythium isolates are going to become resistant to that and find a way to beat that. So obviously, we identified the problem. So what do we do about it, right? So at FGI, at Croplan, we have now introduced a new fungicide into our seed treatment that we also looked at in my work called ethoboxam or Intego Solo. This has been used in soybeans for a few years. It just got EPA approval after my project to use it in alfalfa. And that helps, control those Pythium isolates that are becoming resistant to metalaxyl or methanoxams. But we are also focused on breeding genetic resistance to Pythium. And FGI obviously is leaders in that right now. We're hoping to have varieties in the near future. What that looks like, I don't know. Obviously we've got to see it in the field for 5 years before we commercialize it. There's a lot of work done, to get to breeder seed, commercial seed, all that good stuff. So I don't know how many years we are, out on that, but just the fact that we're talking about Pythium resistance is a big step in the right direction to try to, combat some of these issues to reach that higher yield potential. If you look at the standard tests on alfalfa, and this is me shifting gears a little bit, but if you look at those diseases, Pythium isn't even listed. So Pythium isn't even considered, by the Variety Review Board today as a big issue. And I think Dr. Samick is really pushing to get that added and get a better standard test for that. And, as we develop varieties with Pythium resistance, hopefully we see that. But there's a lot of unknowns out there today as to what that's actually causing, as far as yield damage goes and all that good stuff. I will say too, on the Aphanomyces, Phytophthora, Pythium side, those pathogens continue to chew away at roots over those 4 or 5 years that alfalfa stand is out there. So a grower might not even fully realize what he or she is giving up in the field when they plant a variety that doesn't have high disease resistance to these pathogens versus one that does, because you really can't see those pathogens chewing away at the roots, right? Because the root's under the soil. So they might, just say, that field is yielding fine, but they have no idea what they might be missing by selecting a variety that has high disease resistance to these different pathogens. So that was very long-winded, but diseases are a big deal, very near and dear to my heart. Variety selection is huge when preventing these diseases. And Jeff, you've probably heard me give this talk 1,000 times, but when you think about a disease that will infect any plant, you obviously have your disease triangle, right? And so the 3 factors of that triangle are a conducive environment, the pathogen actually in the soil, and then the variety that you're planting. And like I said, with our pathogens that we are fighting, the Aphanomyces, Phytophthora, Pythium, those oomycete pathogens, those last in the soil for a really long time. They're very prevalent here in the Great Lakes region, in the upper Midwest, out west where we have a lot of water. So those are probably not going to eliminate from the soil. So we can't control that factor of our disease triangle. Then you have your environment. So like I said, they infect in wet soil conditions, pretty much any time of the year on Aphanomyces. So that could be in the spring, could be in the summer, could be in the fall. And then for Pythium and Phytophthora, it's typically in our cold soils. So for me, it would be like, February, March, April, May, when the soils are still pretty cold, we get a lot of rainfall. That's when those pathogens are active. So we're probably not always going to be able to control that factor of the disease triangle either. I can't control how much rainfall we get in the Midwest. Obviously out west, it's a little bit different, but probably not going to be able to control that. So that leaves us with that variety selection piece. And when you select a variety that has high disease resistance to these pathogens, you then eliminate that disease from being able to infect that alfalfa plant. So variety selection really is the number one way to control these diseases today.
We have one alfalfa pathologist in the country.
Correct.
That's a freaking problem.
Absolutely.
She could be the best pathologist in the history of forever. She still needs peers. We need to think about that a little bit as an industry.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Right.
What are the practical implications for the growers? You talk about chewing away at the roots. It's something that we can't readily observe. And I bet you, as you say, chewing away at the roots, if you dug the plant up, is that something that you could see?
I would say you could see it if you had something to compare it to that was not infected.
Oh, okay.
So I think my growers, I always just relate it back to the farmer level, but my growers that are not planting newer genetics with that disease resistance, they might think everything's fine, but say they were to, split a field and look at it, 3 years later and wonder why one side of the field yields much higher than the other. Well, one side was, say, hey, a Croplan AA variety that has all the disease resistance, all the bells and whistles, versus a, older variety that we have that doesn't have that disease resistance, and then wonder why the AA side yielded 15% higher and might, last longer, last another year. Well, that's the implication of that advanced disease resistance. But if you don't have that, they probably don't really know what they're missing and that they're not hitting that full genetic yield potential because they're planting older genetics, because they're not aware of the diseases, all of that. And I run into a lot, and this is, again, you turned it back on us, on the industry a little bit. There's a lot of agronomists, individuals out there that are not fully aware of alfalfa diseases and the implications that they cause and what the newer varieties can do for a grower. And I get on farms a lot with growers that say, all alfalfa is the same. Just give me the cheapest seed. It's all the same anyway. We're going to plant it. Year one, we're going to pull it out in 3 years anyway. And, everything's the same. Just give me the cheapest seed I can find. It's not necessarily the case. And I think, and I got to be careful how I say this, but I think for a grower to then turn around and say, why hasn't my alfalfa yielded any higher than it did in 1980? I got to turn it around on them a little bit and say, well, you got to be selecting varieties that are newer. Yes, they might be a little more expensive, but if you're getting 15 to 20% higher yield with those varieties that have that advanced disease resistance, plus maybe another year out of them, depending on the location, depending on how you manage it, all that good stuff, that easily pays for the cost of the seed.
I want to stop and do some math here. So earlier we talked about $1,400 an acre over a 3-year period. Yeah. Now remember, that's using our university trials, that's replicated trials, no wheel traffic, sure, relatively perfect conditions.
Right.
Let's just take half of that. Let's say that the benefit of the perfect conditions picks you up $700 an acre, and in the real world, we'll look at $700. Let's take 25% of that. Let's look at $350 an acre, and just compare that to the price of the seed. And I had somebody the other day tell me that they could get alfalfa seed for $3.25 a pound. My first response to them was, yeah, and I have some $80 alfalfa to sell you. You're going to get what you pay for, right? I have some alfalfa that I'd sell you for $80 a ton. It's the black and nasty bottom bales, right? Okay, so we're going to take this $325 an acre. That's a quarter of what's realizable in economic gains. We're making some assumptions, but we have to do that to think about this. We're going to take the difference between $3.25 and maybe, using some round numbers, $10 a pound is towards the upper end of the range.
Sure.
Right? We're not going to be we're not going to be dollars and dollars off if we use $10.
You're still on the upper level, but yeah, you're going to be great. Yeah.
Okay, $10 minus $3.25 gets you a difference of $6.75 a pound. Anybody got to throw rocks at me if I use 20 pounds to the acre on alfalfa seeding? Okay.
Perfect, easy number to use.
That's $135 difference per acre. Now, there's cash flow implications, and I realize $10 a pound, putting $200 an acre in seed out there, that's substantial. But even if we only give a quarter of the credit due to new and improved varieties, remember we said we get
$350.
$350.
$215 an acre difference in that potential revenue scenario for that 1 year.
There's just no scenario there. And even if you use $135 on alfalfa, and we're in a rough market condition right now.
Yes.
I bet you if you went back and used $135 on that same math, it would still pay to use the new and improved seed.
And when you quoted the new and improved seed, you added more than just, I mean, you're talking about the Hard Extra trait with extended harvest window, higher quality. So we could even play this farther if we wanted to get silly about the math game. Yes.
Oh, I was just digging through my yields results here a little bit more. The very highest single year number in the variety trials here was 13.5 ton to the acre, and there were 4 varieties north of 13 tons, including 2 cropland varieties.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
The thing about this disease, and Leta, we talk about the trends in the industry, John. I want to go back to that comment or that concept, is that we say, okay, so we feel like yields haven't increased, but we see just this weird little trend down. Well, again, to Leta's point, we have this disease complex, and I'm going to bring this back into the human element. Whether you believe in COVID or not, I want to make a reference to it. So how many times did they talk about the COVID strains and how they've evolved and how they changed over that simple 1, 2, 3 year period where they're like,
a short period of time.
Different. Okay, right?
Yep.
So I think we need to understand that, folks, is that we've had Aphanomyces, Anthracnose, Pythium, all these things out there that will rob alfalfa yield have been around forever. We've combated them multiple times, and the damn things just keep coming back. And what they're saying is that maybe we don't have a new strain, Leta, but it's gotten more virulent or more aggressive. So now we got to find something better to go after this because it's more aggressive. Well, every time it shifts on us, how often are we proactive where we're on the front side of it? It's hard to, because we don't know that it's coming. So you're always chasing the tail of these diseases and trying to react to what they've done. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate too and say, I think the yield potential of these varieties have increased, but we have environmental changes and shifts in disease that have maybe started to take us down at the knees just a little bit before we knew what was happening. And that could be part of that shift.
Absolutely. And I will add, we are very blessed to, have products that come out of the Forage Genetics International pipeline.
Right.
Because FGI is incredibly focused on breeding advancements in disease resistance. So what they do in their program is they will go take all of the Aphanomyces isolates, Phytophthora, whatever it might be, take all these isolates from universities, and they identify their own as well in fields. And they'll throw the hottest mix of pathogens that they can at seed when selecting for new varieties. So they're constantly throwing the newest, most virulent, aggressive stuff that they have at these products. And I can't say the same is said for other companies in the industry. But to your point, John, on only having one alfalfa plant pathologist left in the country, that's concerning for us in an industry standpoint as well, right? Like, if we're focused on breeding the latest and greatest, disease resistance out there, we need those isolates from the universities to help that. And we need the research done at the university level as well. So I think that as we see universities not focused on alfalfa, we see them, cut funding on forage programs. Us at FGI at Croplan has to take that next step in identifying our own isolates in, focused, targeted approaches across the country on identifying new isolates, aggressive isolates, all that good stuff. And we will, but we have to take that leadership in it, unfortunately, because we've seen a lot of universities get away from that.
Oh, I'm just struggling. I have a firm preference for independent third-party research at universities. And a lot of that, and it's nothing against any one particular company, an absolute preference to have third-party independent verification on all of this research. I believe you guys. I trust you guys. I still want it verified by universities. And it's not the university's problem either. It's state legislators not funding universities properly. It's the industry structure a little bit. Our checkoff dollars aren't going as far as they need to. It's those kind of thought processes. And I want to engage those conversations carefully because you guys are doing great work. I still want you guys to have to compete against other breeding companies and have that information in the public that holds you guys to a high standard, and that's good for the industry.
I think we would probably agree with you too that we want to have the universities be at that level where they can validate, verify, help.
Exactly.
Because let's face it, in every spectrum of this world, and we chatted about this a little bit earlier today too, that when people look at the prices of the products that we produce today, it's no secret that input costs to produce everything in this world have gone up. And it's no different from a seed grower where we have to go compete with vegetable acres and fruits and nut trees and vineyards and that to get production acres and research acres. So everything's a little more expensive. And we talked about traits and research and development. It's almost like you need to have a nest egg to get started. And then everything new that comes, it's almost like we have to pay it forward so we can afford to go do it, right? So that's where it really becomes this tough deal where guys are like, alfalfa is too dang expensive. Well, if we're going to do any improvements, we have to continue to support. And none of us are just out here for a free ride. We're all working for what we do.
Absolutely.
So it's crazy that we all have to understand. Anyway, we could get on a whole nother tangent there, but back to these yields. And I want to focus on roots again with one more segment, John. And you and I have talked about this probably a couple times, but how many of us went through a transition in our agronomy lives raising crops where we back in as agronomy really got going with crop protection, we did a lot of tank mixes and residual herbicides to combat weeds. And then we went into this Roundup revolution. Glyphosate technology came in the late 90s for corn and soybeans. And we have 2 decades of agronomists that are Roundup babies. Put Roundup in the tank, we'll take care of it. Corn, soybeans, a couple other crops. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It worked very well. But now we have some opportunities that we need to address that says we have harder to control weeds. So we went back to tank mixes and we spray row crops with these tank mixes and we rotate to an alfalfa crop. And I believe, again, that we see a lot of yield reduction due to slight root damage that we don't outwardly visually see, where we're like, yeah, everything's green, but the yield isn't what it should be. How many times have we assumed that herbicide was degraded with the proper pH, soil texture, rainfall, all of those things varied? And we just talked about drought situations. Every time it gets dry, it slows everything down. Organic matter, all that matters, but it's not dead. So we think these damn companies aren't doing a good job at all. The varieties yield less now than they did before, but I really think our variety potential for yield is higher. It's our management systems and the environment that holds us back more often than everything else. So again, from a root standpoint, if we've damaged the roots with a herbicide and then it gets dry, we have a poor root system that's supposed to do you got one guy doing the job of what 10 people need to do, basically, right? And they struggle. So as we continue to talk about our main topic of what's going on, why do we think yields have suffered a little bit? I think that's one that I wanted to address as well.
Oh,
herbicide rotations.
Herbicide residuals, dinging the new seedings.
Yes.
I will say too, just to bring it back to farmer language, I always say, like, I work with a lot of dairy farmers, obviously, but I compare an alfalfa seedling to a baby calf. And, the first 30 days of a calf's life, Jeff's probably heard me say this a million times, but the first 30 days of a calf's life is the most important time in that life to dictate the overall health of that cow, how long she's going to be in the herd, all that good stuff. So if she gets sick in the first 30 days of her life, she's probably not going to milk as high, last as long in the barn as her herd mates that stayed healthy. Same thing goes for alfalfa, right? So if it faces a disease, if it faces herbicide carryover, if it's got weed pressure, all of those things, if it's got any of those stresses in the first 30 days of its life, that's going to limit the yield potential in the long run too. So stand establishment with the disease, herbicide carryover, fertility, all of those factors play a huge role in what the yield potential is going to look like for that alfalfa stand.
Fertility. How many, you said that in that comment, how many people, John, have really taken the time to think about their alfalfa field and go, you know what? Back in the 60s, 70s, and 90s, we had this huge industrial complex and we had all this manufacturing going on and we had these smokestacks and acid rain and we got free sulfur every day it rained. We've cleaned up our emissions and today we don't get free sulfur. Sulfur is one of the 4 main components in my fertility program to raise a successful alfalfa crop. So if you haven't paid attention to fertility and maybe the crop budget, Mr. Economist says, well, I got about this many assets and I'm going to be able to take this big of a loan and I can only spend X amount of dollars on fertility for my alfalfa crop. And that could also be a limiting factor that it's a balance of economics. Although we know it could potentially limit our yield, it's all I can spend today.
Need your hay dried down faster without leaf loss? Krone Tedders offer the best solution by getting your crop off the field faster. Available in both trailed models and drawbar hitches with the widest range of sizes. All Krone Tedders feature flotation tires and specially engineered tines to lift the crop and distribute it evenly across the swath. Less ash and greener hay? That's the Krone way. Learn more at krone-northamerica.com.
I'm going to poke a little bit here. Do corn and soybean farmers have that same, we already know the answer to this. Do they have the same approach? Do they say, I'm going to short the corn on nitrogen?
Some days it would surprise you the conversations we have in the country, but most generally they raise a corn crop to be a high yield crop and they focus on that every day. Do they maybe cut back on some other bells and whistles? Probably. Mm-hmm. But fertility, nitrogen being the big one, they usually don't skimp much in that arena. It just depends on how bad the economy is. But to your point,
I'm poking a little bit, right?
we don't get the same focus on the queen of forages as we do the corn kings, right? So yes, I would agree to some.
And the conversation that started all of this, the responses were, on my farm, I manage my alfalfa really well and my yields are still going up. My neighbors are just poor managers. Or my neighbors grow corn and soybeans and then a little bit of alfalfa and they kind of ignore their alfalfa because the establishment cost is lower. It's not that seed cost every year. They just don't spend as much time on it. How do we change that mindset? Because it's exactly all the things that you're talking about. Seed selection, herbicide programs, fertility. Yeah. That all takes really hot. That takes a lot of management.
So I have a phrase that I used for 15 years, and I don't know where I came up with it, or somebody said it and I just ran with it. But I comment about that. Why trip over $1 to pick up a dime? And a lot of times, and it doesn't matter which crop I'm talking about, and it's hard to do. I get it. The economic struggle is real. But if you have to spend a little bit more to make a little bit more or take care of that crop, I don't want to say always is a definite, but it generally takes care of itself. And there's usually the potential to make more than you spend if you're doing it wisely. So even though it costs $1 more, you might be leaving 10 on the table by not taking care of it. But how do we change it or fix it, John?
In terms of seed selection, in my mind, we're tripping over $1 and leaving five on the table. That's how I think about from the bottom to the top. There's a 5-fold increase that we're missing.
I think fertility too. I think we're still learning things. I have a lot of people, we talk about doing soil tests. Make sure you do a soil test, do an inventory, know what you have in the soil, have everything, all the groceries out there for that alfalfa plant. Okay, yeah, great. And some people do a great job of that. And they go, hey, I got these soil test result backs. And it says, you guys are talking about over 200 parts per million on potassium. Mine says 400 parts per million. I should be growing alfalfa out my ears, and I'm still limited. It tells me that a tissue sample tells me I'm deficient in potassium. How can this be? But I think the more we know about some of these nutrients, we're finding out that, depending on your soil type and your type of clay and the moisture content available, you might have 400 parts per million out there. But if it's tied up between clay platelets and there's not enough moisture to get it across that gradient into the root. Yep, plant's deficient, can't get it. So you got to irrigate more, but you can't irrigate more because you're limited on water, or the canal's shut off, or you're just in an area that's so damn dry, like you, where you get an inch in 7 months.
Did you tell Leta that I established an alfalfa field on 4 inches of soil moisture and 3/4 of an inch of rain?
And it worked.
Impressive.
He saw it. I don't know that I have perfect management, but I don't know what else I could have done better. No, we have some tough conditions.
There's just all that out there. And I think another point was made by one of our colleagues that, corn, the row crop business is such a complex today that a lot of times these alfalfa acres get put on marginal soils that they're like, you know what? It'll live out there. It kind of goes dormant. It's not going to die per se if it gets a little dry or it's not the best conditions. But to that point, when they have a high corn and soybean yield potential on a good piece of dirt, that's what they're going to do. And again, like we've all discussed, this is generalized comments. Mm-hmm. The really good hardcore hay grower does not do that. They're going to use the best acre. But on somebody that alfalfa isn't 80% of their brain, and you're on the 20%, those are the acres that get put on the crappy acre, doesn't raise good corn. We always get an insurance payment, that kind of thing. So again, reported yields aren't going to get better if we have set it up for failure to begin with, if you want to say it that way.
I will add more on that potash thing. That potash thing is huge. That's what I see the most, is growers cutting their potash rates or thinking they're getting it from manure. They're going out there and I get it too. I mean, we have dairy farmers whose pits are full, manure pits are full. They need somewhere to spread manure. Hey, we just took alfalfa off yesterday. Our pit's full. We have an open field. Let's go apply it. I realize we don't live in a perfect world. I'm a dairy kid. I understand that we've got to get rid of manure. I understand all that. But in an ideal world, manure tankers, I'm not going to recommend that on alfalfa. We go back to that wheel traffic thing too. Definitely plays a role in hurting those roots, hurting those crowns. One thing I hear a lot is, okay, yes, I'm not going to go drive on my alfalfa field, but I'm going to drag line manure out there and I'm going to get all the potash I need from drag lining after every cutting so I don't have to apply, potash fertilizer. Not necessarily going to work, even if it does test high in potassium. And that's just because that potassium in that manure is not going to be available to the plant like an actual potassium fertilizer or potash would.
Eventually it will, right?
Eventually it will, but not for that growth.
I want to finish this out with a real focus on what producers can do. Jeremy Clarkston has done so much good for the ag industry, just teaching people what tram lines are. Have you watched Clarkston's farm? It's wonderful. If you haven't, every farmer will love Clarkston's farm. It's Jeremy Clarkston, the car guy. He goes out and buys a farm, and nearly every episode is, what do you mean there's a regulation against doing that? But he focuses, there's a lot of discussions on tram lines and GPS and controlled traffic in fields, right? So yes. That's actually something that I'm working on very, very hard. I'm going to hurt your feelings a little bit and tell you that we're still harrowing fields, scratching the crowns a little bit, right? But we're knocking down gopher mounds. As we're harrowing, as we're fertilizing, and as we're spraying, I'm driving in the exact same tracks. When we get to harvest, that all goes to heck, right? The math doesn't work. Maybe I can get a 36-foot swather, right? TJ Steele, I'm hanging out with TJ Steele today. He has one that would do that.
Yeah.
And then maybe we could get a 36-foot merger, and 36 foot is what I'm working with and on.
Right. Yeah.
That's 36 foot of fertilizer, 72 foot of sprayer. The math works, right? And maybe there's other combinations. Yep. Those are the things that I'm trying to get to limit the amount of damage. And if I were a dairyman, I would be figuring out how to get whatever width swather matched with whatever width merger, and then teach my chopper guy to shoot backwards right behind me and keep the semi trucks in the same tracks. And you'll have bare dirt in those tracks. Nothing's going to grow in the tracks, but you won't be damaging all of the other plants every single cutting. And really, as we're talking about our replicated university trials, that's what they're doing. Yeah. They're just not driving where they're growing the crop. They're driving next to it.
Or yes, exactly. They're doing 3-foot plots and have 4-foot equipment. So they're basically not harvesting the wheel tracks. So yeah, exactly.
Those are the things that I'm thinking about in terms of management techniques that growers can use. And as we're talking about Rob Boyle down in Arizona that we've mentioned a couple of times, he's talking about Krone Big M's. He's bigger swathers. He's talking about big rakes. Now they're harvesting between irrigation checks, but they're trying to make, right now they're making silage, trying to make one windrow on a 60-foot irrigation check. And that means that chopper's driving on the same tracks as the
down
rake,
the center every time.
Right down the center every time. There's only one set of wheel tracks through there. Those are the kind of management techniques that I think producers can work on and get better at. When it comes to dry hay production, bales, I don't have the answer. Maybe those big rakes are the answer, and just pulling it into one big gigantic windrow.
Yeah. And it's not financially feasible for everybody, but I love these accumulator systems today where we can drop on the end.
Oh, yeah.
And we're not having to drive willy-nilly across the alfalfa field after every bale. And even in my simple little operation in my mind, I literally make a map in my brain when I drop the bale at the end and come back to go get the next one. Where can I limit my wheel traffic versus driving straight towards it from the gate? Mm-hmm. I might use the driveway and then just branch a little off of it and use the same driveway 5 or 6 times to grab different hay instead of just that straight line spider web. I just different little things like that could be the difference in 5 or 10% someday.
Yep. And then
I agree.
Big windrows when you're baling, pulling multiple rows together. And little baling is hard, right? Because you don't have that ability to accumulate bales behind the baler. You have to drive a bale wagon through the field 7 to 10 days after you cut it. And that bale wagon does a lot of damage.
Yeah, there's all of those things. It just keeps adding up. Absolutely.
John, I don't know if you were aware or not of Dr. Brian Luck's research at the University of Wisconsin looking at wheel traffic damage. But this would be, in Wisconsin, where obviously they're chopping for haylage. They're not doing dry bales. But you're going to have to fact check me on this, but I believe that they found in their study, and I don't know how they figured this out, but I believe they found about 49% of the field is driven over in a normal harvesting scenario for haylage. So that would be the mower, merger, chopper, trucks. It's 49%. In my head, that felt really large to me. That's a good chunk of the field that's getting run over. And, his recommendations were exactly what you said, just pick your one rows that you're going down. But even, flotation tires instead of road tires. And I understand that they're expensive. I know that if you're going, 30 miles away to a field, that's
and it doesn't
probably
work
not
on trucks. Yeah.
Exactly. But just little stuff like that can definitely help. But that would be one research project to keep an eye on. I think it's still ongoing. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see updated data from that, because I think that was like 2020, 2021 data.
Good record-keeping systems. That's, as we think about things that growers can do, good record-keeping systems, particularly around fertility and herbicides. Knowing what you've had out there.
Mm-hmm. Good record-keeping systems to financially know, is that acre still producing me an income? Because we also have this thing about, I know that stand maybe isn't quite as good as it should be, but I really don't want to start a new one this year. So I'm just going to limp this baby along for one more year because my seed cost me, again, $4.50 to $10 a pound on that acre, and I'm not willing to spend that today. So how many times do we have underperforming fields that need rotated and they're not? And again, they get reported, the yields are down, We might have a ice storm in a part of the country, and they're like, it's bad, but it's not bad enough to make me do it today. I'm just going to limp through.
Oh, don't say those things. Winter kill is my biggest nightmare.
Well, just forget all about it. Visit with TJ today and have a good night.
Would you guys fix the autotoxicity issues so that when I do get winter damage, I can go right back into alfalfa instead of losing my hind end on a crappy rotation crop for 2 years?
Yeah, that would be an interesting piece if we could. So that would be a technology event. So that plant would not produce any metacarpins anymore, right? So that would be interesting.
That's so economically damaging because we put in a stand of Roundup Ready alfalfa, and on year 2, and remember for us, we're spring planting.
Yeah.
I took half of a first cutting off in year 1. I took another cut, and then I took 3 more cuttings off, and then it winter killed. I got 4 cuttings out of a new stand of alfalfa. Mm-hmm. And then I had to rotate out to a junk rotation crop where I'm at that I lost money on for 2 years. And then I could finally come back. And I'm here to tell you on that particular field, I didn't put alfalfa back in.
Yeah.
I know that's a tough relationship. That, like, technically speaking, getting rid of autotoxicity is a almost non-starter, but it's a frustration. And you don't have that in corn, soybeans, wheat, or any other grain.
You're not wrong. Yes, and the whole message would go like this: if everybody would whip out their checkbook, the technology says that we could probably accomplish anything we want. It's just what's it going to cost and what's our inherent value.
I know. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. Tune in for the second half of this episode in a couple of weeks.